As you can see, I'm putting up this Word file because I'm going to be typing while I'm speaking so you can follow what I'm saying. I hope you don't mind that. So you're just going to be seeing this white piece of paper for the most part. First of all, I want to thank Ilya for inviting me and also for suggesting this topic for the conference. If science is a public good, right? So this is the topic for the conference. And so my particular take on it has to do with why, if science is a public good, why do scientists own it? Okay. And so this is kind of the starting question. And in the latest issue of the Russian journal, Epistemology and Philosophy of Science, there is a symposium that is around my paper that is related to this talk. So if you want to find out, in more detail what the argument is and so forth, it is actually already published. And so you can check that out. But what I want to do here is to sort of go through the basic points of the argument, and because I think it goes very deeply to how we think about the idea of public good and how we think about science. And in a way, putting this phrase together, science is a public good, somewhat problematizes both of them. Okay, I want to start this by talking about the idea of public good, okay? And this concept, and when I say public good, I really want to keep our mind focused on the sort of political economy notion of public good. In other words, I don't treat public good in the beginning as just a synonym for common good or something like that, but rather it has a kind of specific meaning, which is very closely associated historically with the development of welfare states, okay? And this is basically the idea that there are certain goods that the state needs to provide through taxation usually, right? Because individuals or corporations would not be motivated to provide them through the market, right? So in other words, public goods arise through market failure. So this is a very kind of capitalist way of framing the issue. But what it does is it provides a kind of justification for the state, okay? And so the concept of public good in this sense, in this rather clear sense, right, is normally due to Paul Samuelson, who was one of the leading welfare state economists and author of a big best-selling introductory economics textbook, perhaps the dominant one in the second half of the 20th century. And he's the one who writes about this initially in the 1940s, right, after World War II. And so the thing is that this is kind of the starting point, and it's under those circumstances, right, under that kind of a definition, that one talks about the extent to which knowledge or science, right, might be thought of as a public good. And so generally speaking, there have been two kinds of attitudes toward parsing this out, okay? And these attitudes, in a way, start to separate more and more in the late 20th century. But as you'll see, this actually has roots that goes back much farther. And so in the paper, I talk about one side as a kind of social democracy, you might call Keynesian version. And what that has to do is with the idea that the way in which knowledge or science is a public good, right, isn't necessarily because everyone is able to participate in it directly. So in other words, it's not about everyone going to university, for example, but rather what you do is the state subsidizes through everyone's taxation, right, the ability of a few people to go to university, who then end up benefiting society as a whole because of the added value of their knowledge, right? I mean, that's the theory. So the idea is that you could raise taxation to a level, right, where the state could basically pay for free to enable, let's say, 10 or 20% of the population to get a free university education, because those people will add value to other people in the society. So it's in Keynes's terms, a multiplier effect, right? So knowledge has a kind of multiplier effect in society. And that was the original idea. And it was very much tied to welfare state, social democratic notions of meritocracy, where people have to take examinations to get into universities and things like this. And that was very much the dominant model. And so if you look at the number of people who went to universities in welfare state countries, right, with the exception of the United States, which has a very mixed economic system, obviously, right, it's not so strongly state driven, right, it was relatively low, right, the number of but then this gradually expanded over the course of the late 20th century. And so a different kind of model started to emerge, especially once you got into the so-called fiscal crisis of the welfare state. And so then people started thinking about knowledge as a public good as perhaps something that everyone should have to boost the economy more generally to become productive. And so this becomes part of the move to create more universities, to get more people to go to universities. And it's closely associated with a sort of neoliberalism and the idea of the knowledge economy, right? That in some sense, everyone's got to be participating in it, right? Everyone's got to go to university. Everyone needs a degree, because that's the way you're really going to boost the economy. And you can't count on the sort of, traditional state redistribution of wealth to enable a few people to go. You actually have to get everyone involved. And so this is a great period of university expansion. A lot of things get called universities that were previously not universities. And at one level, it's a much more democratic notion, you might say, of knowledge as a public good, because it requires everyone to actually participate in it. And it's in this business, in this context, that one talks a lot about investing in human capital, right? That a university education, right, is an investment in human capital. And so the idea would be that if everyone went to university, everyone would be more productive, the society would be wealthier, et cetera, et cetera. And in some way, this would sort of boost the society as a whole into this whole new world called the knowledge economy, right? And this was very closely tied to the rise of the information age and, the rise of computer networks and all of this, so if we're thinking about the 1980s, early 1990s, right, this kind of imaginary. Well, the thing was that didn't work so much either, in the sense that the amount of payback, you might say, to society from everybody going to university didn't seem to be worth the investment. And this is one of the reasons why we have a crisis in how universities legitimize themselves these days, because universities were seen as these places that could grow indefinitely, okay, and then the society would become richer. But in fact, that is not what's happened. Right. And in a sense, brute economic forces, we could go into details about why this is the case, nevertheless has prevented this from happening. And so now there is a kind of crisis of justifying what universities are for in general, given the sort of, tighter economic conditions that especially the state finds itself in. OK, and I should say throughout this whole argument, universities were supporting every stage of the argument. Right. So universities supported the social democratic version of public good, and they supported the neoliberal version of public good. Universities, in a sense, are not victims to this. They are actually complicit in what has happened. And so this then raises, and so one of the things that we're seeing now very much, with regard to crises concerning the university is exactly, what the soul of the university is. And if we're talking about knowledge is a public good and the university is somehow responsible for it, right? Then what is it that we're talking about? Because it's clearly not the case that simply getting people going to university is going to solve the problem. And here, there are several kinds of issues that start to arise. And here I think it's really important to see where the idea of the state as being, as a state being specifically concerned with knowledge production, and in particular universities, becomes an issue. Because for most of history, if we're talking, if we think about knowledge production in a very broad way throughout history, you could say two things. The first thing is that most of the innovation has come from what we would normally call the private sector. Right, in the sense that it's been independent researchers, right? They may have had university ties, but they weren't on university grants or anything like that, right? And increasingly, as we move into the modern period, right, we have corporate sponsorship of research that actually moves science in very radical directions. And if you think about the Rockefeller Foundation and the impact that it had on the development of biology and the social sciences in the 20th century, right? The creation of molecular biology, a lot of work management stuff and social psychology, right? Very influential, really influenced a lot of stuff. But all of these innovations actually have come from what we would normally call the private sector. And so then the question becomes, what is the public sector about? And of course, the public sector has always been about universities, but universities, for the most part, right, have been teaching institutions, okay, rather than research institutions. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people in the late 19th and 20th centuries ended up looking for private funding, and in some cases, moving to the private sector altogether, right? Because universities have been about teaching, and teaching has been primarily about reproducing the social order as it already exists, right? So the rule about credentials, right? The original kind of university degrees were basically degrees that would allow you to administer in medicine, administer in law, administer in theology, right? These are the original degrees, right? And then in the 19th century, you know, you start to get these things of disciplines, academic disciplines in the modern sense of the word, right? Which have to do with subject matters, right? That have specialists who basically spend their time working on it, right? And that's normally how we think about academic disciplines today. And that does involve a research component to it, right? Increasingly so. And of course, Humboldt was very instrumental. Wilhelm von Humboldt was very instrumental in bringing research into the university, right? Bringing as part of the Enlightenment mission of the university. Because if you remember, those French Enlightenment guys in particular were very hostile to the university as an institution, right? And the reason why they were supporting independent academies, right, was because the independent academies actually allowed a freedom of research that the universities did not allow because they were controlled by the church. So what Humboldt did was to bring that in, right, to bring the research side into the university. And you know, I don't want to go through the whole history because it's not quite as Humboldt imagined it would happen, but nevertheless, that was really important in creating this kind of modern conception, right, that universities are the seat by which knowledge is produced as a public good. And so the state has some direct involvement in that as the funder of the university, right? And even the creator of universities and maintainer of universities. And certainly Humboldt thought of it that way, right? It was a state function. Okay, well, what happens? Well, what happens is various kinds of political economy regimes develop over the course of especially the 20th century. And in which basically government devolves powers to universities to decide funding matters for themselves because they are the best places to decide knowledge as a public good. Fine. But then the question becomes, what is going to be driving this kind of agenda? And there's a particular way in which we think about this today, or at least as the default position today, which I think is actually only about, let's say, 60 years old, but nevertheless, I think becomes the default position, which has to do with academic disciplines themselves, right? Controlling how knowledge as a public good is disposed, right? So in other words, a devolution from state power directly to the academic disciplines, and then the academic disciplines decide what knowledge is a public good. I talk about this in the paper. And I think what was the very crucial moment that sort of crystallized this kind of position in the post-Second World War period was the establishment of the National Science Foundation in the United States. And this created the kind of position that I think a lot of people sort of take for granted today, regardless of what discipline they're in, and even if they don't live in the United States, okay? Because this is very much a product of a certain kind of American development in the state, but it has had a lot of intellectual influence generally. So the idea here is that knowledge is produced through a peer review process where the knowledge producers decide amongst themselves, right, what knowledge needs to be produced. And this is through the research process primarily, right? And then the classrooms, in a way, ratify this, right? So the kind of stuff you're teaching in the classrooms, right, is the stuff that, in a sense, has been based on stuff that has passed through the peer review process. And then the idea being that this then carries on further into the larger society through the applications of knowledge, right? And so this is sometimes called the linear model of science policy, right? And it has a kind of hierarchical arrangement, right? The peer reviews system decides what is knowledge, right? It is then taught in the classroom, and then the people who learn the stuff apply it in society at large, okay? Now, the funny thing about this model, which is very much, you may know Vannevar Bush, the vice president of MIT, who was very much the promoter of this idea very successfully to politicians in the United States after the Second World War. The interesting thing is that in his famous book, you know, Science, the Endless Frontier, he focuses on the atomic bomb project, okay, the American atomic bomb project. And the thing about that project was that, yes, indeed, it did involve, as it were, the top scientists, right? The ones who passed the peer review, as it were. They were the ones who were kind of designing and masterminding the whole thing, okay? But the point is that the project itself was not started by peer review, right? The project itself was actually started when Albert Einstein made a phone call to Franklin Roosevelt, the president, and said that Nazis were planning an atomic bomb and that America needed to get going on this, okay? And then the government, right, and in particular the Defense Department, right, started to organize the scientists, started bringing them in, right? And of course the scientists were consulted with regard to which scientists could be, you know, brought in and all the rest of it. But the point is that the project itself, the conceptualization of the project, everything up to the point, you know, except for the execution, that is to say, the actual design and creation of the bomb. But everything prior to that was actually driven by the state, okay? And there is a name. So in other words, this kind of approach does not actually satisfy the kind of linear model, right, that Vannevar Bush was promoting after the war, okay? And so one of the interesting things that one would say historically about the rise of the National Science Foundation, right, it was that it involved a certain kind of academic capture of science as a public good, right? In other words, the academics, in a way, took over, right, in a sense, controlled the show, and the state let them do it, okay? And that was what the National Science Foundation was about. Now, the interesting thing about this, right, is that let's say we fast forward, a dozen years or so, and then the Russians, the Soviets launch Sputnik, okay? And so the first artificial space satellite, 1957. And so what happens is that President Eisenhower asks the National Science Foundation and the National Academy of Sciences and all these peer review organizations, right, of American science, where the best scientists in the country were and so forth, what they made of this Sputnik thing. And they said, no problem, we understand how it works. You know, we've got the technology there, et cetera, right? So in other words, they treated this as something that in a way, from the standpoint of a technology, it wasn't all that original, right? They already knew how it worked. They knew, you know, so they weren't fussed. They said nothing to worry about. Now, Eisenhower's defense secretary, a guy named Neil McElroy, he thought very differently about this. And he thought, look, you know, these satellites are the beginning. They're a game changer. It's going to make space, right, the new frontier of warfare, right? And it's not, you know, you don't necessarily have to be talking about, you know, satellites shooting each other, but in terms of the way in which one is going to understand scientific and technological progress more generally, okay? And so it becomes very important then Because what he saw the Soviets doing was basically changing the rules of the game by which countries competed with each other. Okay. And that the scientists were not clued into this. The scientists were simply clued in to whether what they saw, this piece of technology, whether it was, genuinely original or whether it was something that they could understand because of what they already knew from science and engineering. Right. So McElroy saw this as a kind of paradigm change, you might say, and that the scientists really didn't recognize it for what it is. And so McElroy suggests this other organization, which exists as well in the United States, called DARPA, right? The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Okay. And what it's devoted to, and this is what's interesting, it's devoted also to science as a public good, but it's very future forward. In other words, it is looking at the next generation science, the next generation technology. It's trying to get ahead of the game. It's not just trying to, as it were, provide knowledge that, as it were, satisfies the standards of the best people of the day, but rather thinking about the knowledge that is going to be needed in the future to protect and enhance the country. So there's a conception of science as the public good there, right? But it is one that brings the state back in, right, in a stronger role, right, in terms of organizing stuff. And the structure of DARPA, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is that DARPA comes up with big ideas. So among DARPA's ideas, in case you don't know, is virtual reality, right? The internet came from DARPA, okay? Drone, right? Drones that you see flying around came from DARPA. All these things came from DARPA. And it's all about next generation stuff. And so the thing is that the way DARPA operates is that it comes up with these big ideas. In other words, they would say, there are these needs on the horizon, right? And they would often seem very science fictional, perhaps. And then what they do is they invite people to try to make those ideas concrete, right? And these people can come from any discipline. They can come from any discipline. They don't have to even come from universities. They can come from the private sector, even independent inventors. They'll take, they'll look at what they're saying, right? So it's very much a kind of you might almost say crowdsourcing kind of approach to research, right? Where you basically look at what kinds of proposals that are being brought forward to get in, to work on these things. And so what they do is they give some initial grants to people, and then they see what they come up with again. And then they do this through several iterations, right? Until a few of these proposals are very concrete. They put a lot of money into them, and then they make something happen. Okay. Now, this is a different idea of seeing science as a public good, because what it does is it doesn't start from the assumption that the way in which knowledge is generally divided within the academy is necessarily the best way for knowledge to become public. It is certainly the best way for the academics to continue to legitimize themselves, but it is not clear that it is the best way for knowledge to become public. And so DARPA, in a way, looks at this issue from a totally different angle, right? From the National Science Foundation. And both of these organizations coexist, right? They coexist in the United States. Other countries have their versions of them. If you read my article, you will see that in the UK, we are considering coming up with a version of DARPA. And there is a lot of opposition from the mainstream academic scientific establishment in Britain, because they're afraid, right, that in fact, this peer review based science will be undercut. Now, when I say peer review, I want to be very clear about this. When I say peer review, I am not objecting to the idea that in some sense, the work needs to uphold certain kinds of standards of reliability and validity. And you have to show that you've done what you claim to have done. All that basic kind of stuff that we associate with, with testing standards, right? That aspect of peer review, right? A kind of methodological kind of insurance policy, right, is fine, right? But the part about peer review that is problematic from the standpoint of science as a public good is somehow the idea that the scientists themselves are entitled to think that simply continuing the same research they've been doing in the past is actually the best way to serve the public good. In other words, some research, which is very well regarded and peer-reviewed, may in fact be only of relevance to other people working in the field. This is an obvious point. But the problem with peer review as it currently exists is that the methodological judgments about whether the work is valid or reliable or coherent or whatever, those judgments tend to get mixed up with more substantive judgments about the content, where somehow you're saying, this work is great because we've got 50 people already working on it and this will help our project, right? Or this work is awful because it doesn't fit the trends in our field, it belongs somewhere else, right? See, it's those kinds of judgments which also arise in peer review, which are potentially problematic, okay? And this is one reason why, of course, historically, especially as we move into more modern period, why a lot of the innovation stuff gets done outside of universities, because very often the academic scientists do not recognize, they cannot see, kind of the novelty or the value or the originality of the stuff because they're looking at the stuff the wrong way, okay? And so this is where something like DARPA comes in, and people have all kinds of issues they raise about DARPA. But the point is that this kind of way of thinking about science as a public good, the DARPA way of thinking about it, does have a kind of precedent in history, okay? And here, I want to raise a concept that was first floated in name in the late 1990s by a guy who worked at the Brookings Institution, which is a sort of center-left think tank in Washington, a guy by the name of Donald Stokes, a political scientist by training, and he brought up the concept of Pasteur's quadrant. Pasteur's quadrant. And basically what Stokes was trying to do, and this was in a way, the context of Stokes's writing was trying to figure out the overall direction of American science policy after the end of the Cold War, okay? Because in the Cold War, as you probably know, right, a lot of research was very much defense-oriented, and that tended to privilege certain fields, especially physics-based fields, right, and computer-based fields and things like that, chemistry. But then after the Cold War, things change, right? There's not so much funding for basic research anymore. There's a greater sense of accountability for research, that peer review is not sufficient, that in some sense it has to be relevant, right? All of these issues start to become increasingly important after the Cold War because the concept of public good is no longer so unified. You see, the thing about the Cold War that was so important to the concept of knowledge as a public good was that, in a sense, when you are in some kind of quasi-antagonistic military situation, right, the whole society thinks about itself as being on the same side, right, as being together, as being collectivized, right? Even in the most liberal societies, this happens, right? And so this actually makes the idea of public good more compelling, right? And so these arguments that I was mentioning about Samuelson, it is no accident that they start to get made very explicitly, right, in the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, and the Cold War is generally seen as having been a kind of golden age for the public funding of academic research and education, right? The Cold War has usually been seen as a kind of golden age. And this has a lot to do with, I think, the kinds of notions of society that people had at the time, which made the idea of a unified public clear. But it is not so clear, right? After the end of the Cold War, it is not so clear. And so this is where something like Pasteur's quadrant comes in. Because what Pasteur's quadrant is about the idea of what we would normally call basic research, theoretically oriented research, if it were, as it were, right? That research arises from practical considerations, right? So in other words, it is turning on its head what I was earlier calling the linear model of science policy, right? Because the linear model is that you do the science first, and it's peer reviewed and all that. You then teach it to the students, and then the students go out there and they do something with the knowledge. Okay, that's the linear model. And the thing is, it's led very much by the theory, by the pure basic researchers. Pasteur's quadrant says the opposite, namely that a situation, as it were, a situation, right, creates an opportunity, right, for people who come from many different fields, many different backgrounds, to work together to create a new body of knowledge that then anchors a new knowledge system. Okay, that is the argument that Pasteur's quadrant makes. And you might say the atomic bomb project would fit that, right? In the sense that, there were some relatively primitive particle accelerators before World War II started. Of course, there were some, right? But they could fit into the basement, of an academic building, okay? You had nothing like CERN or anything like that going on at the time. But what happened was, once you start to build the atomic bomb and you start to scale up in a certain way with a certain agenda, then all of the sciences that are involved in this end up changing the way they operate in very decisive ways, right? And in ways that persist after, the emergency is over. And so in the case of Pasteur's quadrant, of course, epidemiology, right, arises as a field and becomes very important in medicine, right? And this is, by the way, in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, right, of 1870. And of course, the other person who is very important in this story, of course, is Robert Koch, okay, basically the German version of Pasteur. And here, epidemiology, right, which develops around the issues of disease in warfare and open fields and how it affects agriculture and all the rest of it, right, this field, right, then becomes incredibly important in anchoring the way in which medical science develops in terms of developments of vaccines, for example, right, in terms of how people think about disease more generally, the germ theory of disease, right? All of these things then become anchor points, ontological, you might say, anchor points for the development of medicine in the 20th century, right? And of course, we still live with that. And so this is the kind of model that, in a way, that Stokes is promoting here. It's this kind of model of how science becomes a public good. It's by having been responsive to a real world problem, which then persists, and then you have these sciences and knowledge that are available, right, to enable the society to survive better in the future, right? And then all of the theory, all the conceptualization, in a way, gets built around that. That's the model he's thinking about. Now, this kind of idea really struck me earlier this year because Mauro Ferrari, who was the director of the European Research Council. The European Research Council is basically the European Union's equivalent of the National Science Foundation in the United States. He resigned, okay? He resigned because he said that the academic science community in Europe, who are the people who sit on the peer review panels of the European Research Council, were ill-equipped, unready, uninterested even in dealing with the special issues that arise from the pandemic, from the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? And so he resigned. Now, Ferrari himself is a pioneer in nanomedicine. And nanomedicine, right, as you know, right, it has to do with actually practicing medicine, you might say, at the nano level, right? Very kind of microscopic interventions. And he pioneered this in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And this is another example of the Pasteur's quadrant thing, right? Which had to do with the rise of nanotechnology, which is something that actually came from the private sector to a large extent, from chemistry, and then bringing it in to all these disciplines and transforming the way these disciplines operate. Okay. And so Ferrari resigned because he saw that the European Research Council was just not responsive, did not see, as it were, the intellectual opportunities, not just the ability, not just the capacity to save people's lives or whatever, right? But also the intellectual opportunities to kind of think in a different frame about how we regard disease, how we think about, immunity and stuff like that, right? Because the nature of populations today, right, and how populations transmit disease and even how they find out about disease is radically different from Pasteur's day and for most of the developments that were made in epidemiology in the 20th century. Okay, and so there was a new opportunity here, right? A new kind of science mentality that can arise from the pandemic, right? And that the European Research Council was not taking advantage of the opportunity. So he resigns, right? And it's a big stink, and people have all kinds of things to say about that. My point is, I think this kind of Pasteur's quadrant approach, right, to think about science as a public good is actually a very useful one, especially for thinking about the research side, right? For thinking about the sense in which scientific research can be seen as contributing to science as a public good. But there's a more kind of general point I want to make with regard to universities, because if you think about what I'm saying so far, I'm giving you this story where, in a sense, okay, science can become a public good by having an emergency, right? And then you bring in all kinds of scientists from all kinds of fields, right? And then they do something amazing, right? And that then anchors, right, the science, in the sense that all the sciences that contributed to this, solving this emergency, right, they are all changed. You get a different kind of scientific constellation as a result of dealing with this problem. Okay, now this stuff gets into universities. Now so how is it to be taught? Because here's the problem, of course, if you've been thinking about this, right? All of this knowledge that originates outside the university, once it gets into the university, does it then become this kind of peer review, routinized, right, discipline-based, repetition, right, which was the problem that the Enlightenment people originally found with the universities as they existed in the 18th century, right? This tendency, as it were, for knowledge to become bureaucratized and routinized, and as it were, the emancipatory power of knowledge, the ability of people to do new things with knowledge, the empowering quality of knowledge is lost, and instead all you've got are credentials, right? People who get degrees and they allow them to do stuff, but the knowledge itself is not really animating much. This is a real problem. And so this is where I would make a general point, and this will be my conclusion, is that throughout the time I've been thinking about science as a public good, and I've been thinking about this now for a good long time, at least since my book, The Governance of Science, which was published 20 years ago. One of the things that's been very much, that's animated the way I think about this is the first point is that research is by definition, especially if we're talking about innovative research. I don't mean research that just repeats what other people have said, but if you're talking about innovative research, there is a sense in which it is inherently elite, right? In the sense that it is ahead of the curve. It is new, right? It is original, right? All of these words, right? The word, it is something unexpected, right? And the thing is, of course, whether, if you think about how innovations are made, there is this quality to it, right? In the sense, so whether we're talking about an emergency, some kind of radical event, forcing people to think about the world in a different way, right? That's a very unusual thing, right? The invention of the atomic bomb, right, happened once, and it was on top of that all of this innovation happened. You can say this about a lot of things, right? And the question then becomes, how do you spread the knowledge that originates from, let's say, this, this singular event, this elite group of people who were originally empowered to produce it? How do you do that? Well, the answer that I always say is that it will turn on what teaching is about. In other words, the answer to the question of how do you make research a public good, right, is going to have to do with the way you teach. And in a sense, we do not spend enough time, I think, you might say, on the epistemological dimension of teaching, right? And in particular, so in other words, we focus too much, I think, as academics who spend our time teaching, we focus too much on getting students to, as it were, be able to reproduce technical detail, technical language, right? Technical stuff. In other words, stuff that when you say it, right, tells other people that you know something, right? What's often called jargon, right? If you want to be very crass about it. That a lot of teaching is actually about that, right? And that as a result, students never really get a sense of what the knowledge is in practice, or what it means even in any kind of conceptual sense, right? So they're able to, as it were, reproduce words on a page to pass an examination, but they don't know what it's like for the knowledge to be integrated into their lives, into their minds, and all the rest of it, right? And this is why we always hear, and I'm sure you experience this too, right? Students learn stuff to pass the exam and they forget about it the next day, right? They forget about it the next day. There's very little knowledge that students actually learn at university they keep. And you might say, the students are ungrateful or they're stupid. No, it's that, basically it's not presented to them as something worth keeping beyond the time of the classroom, because it is purely technical. It is purely jargon. It's pure, it's philosophy about being in the philosophy class, right? I mean, that's about it. And I think that's true with a lot of disciplines, actually. And it is a problem. This is the kind of problem that leads to universities, becoming eventually very conservative kinds of institutions. And the way I would put this is in how one thinks about public good, right? And if we think about the good, as it were, the nature of good in public good, there are two ways you might imagine this from a kind of economic standpoint. One way, which I think is the way in which, unfortunately, academics tend to operate, right, is to think about good as a kind of property, right? Like a piece of property, something you own. And that's why credentials are very important in a sense, in terms of the way in which knowledge is transacted, right? Credential is like giving someone a sort of deed or entitlement to a piece of land that they now own, right? This is kind of the way in which we think about the transmission of knowledge, right? And that is one conception of knowledge as a good, is as property. And from that standpoint, then, the way you would think about something like peer review and all of the kind of policing that goes around knowledge, right? In other words, being careful about who is allowed to speak on behalf of a discipline, what you can say on behalf of a discipline, right? This starts to border on rentiership, right? In other words, it becomes this way of, as it were, keeping the property separate, right? Enhancing its value simply from ownership without necessarily doing anything productive with it, right? And that's one way. And I think academics, in a way, tend to think about knowledge that way, and even when they are in the classroom teaching it. But the other way to think about knowledge as a public good, the good part of it, right, is to think about knowledge as a utility. And the point about a utility, right, is to focus on the functionality of the knowledge, right? The functionality, right? In other words, what can you do with this knowledge, right? What does this knowledge get you? How can you use this knowledge, right, in a way to empower you? And so it becomes very important then that if you're going to put students in a frame of mind that they can actually incorporate the knowledge you're teaching them, right, that you have to engage in some very substantial translation, right? In other words, students may be reading, right, very difficult, very abstract philosophy, whatever, or science, or whatever. But you, as the teacher in the classroom who is guiding them through this stuff, it's your responsibility, if you want to make knowledge a public good, to somehow animate it for them. Show, in fact, that you can do something with this. Show them that there's, in fact, a way in which you can incorporate this into your own thinking, into your own life, into whatever, right? And it's up to you, as it were, as the teacher, to do that. And it's at that point, it's in that translation moment that actually knowledge becomes a public good in a really robust sense, right? In the sense that the knowledge actually gets to be incorporated in people who were not involved in the production of the knowledge. In other words, non-researchers, right? When we are in the classroom training students, we are not training baby researchers. We are training real people, okay? And so the point is that we actually have to make the knowledge available to them. And if knowledge is a public good, right? If the knowledge that is being produced by the researchers is a public good, then this translation should be possible, right? And that it might even be a test of whether knowledge is a public good. It's just how empowered one is with the knowledge. And that is the responsibility of the teacher. Now, I'm not saying that every teacher is good at this, and I'm not saying that every, academic needs to be a teacher, but I am saying that teaching performs a very important and integral role as we take forward this idea of science as a public good. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.